Still awake? Yeah, me too, some nights. The ritual doesn't always work. That's all right. Let me tell you a story. If you want, drop a word in the comments. Whatever's on your mind tonight. Sometimes it helps to name it. Picture a young man standing in a narrow Parisian street in 1863. 24 years old, Claude Monet holds a letter in his hands. Another rejection from the Salon. The official jury has dismissed his work again. Too unconventional, they say. Not refined enough for proper exhibition. I know that feeling. When something you've poured yourself into gets turned away. Monet had spent years learning the traditional way, copying masters in the Louvre, studying anatomy, mixing the perfect browns and ochres that professors demanded. 20 years of training, dissolved like morning mist. But here's what strikes me about that moment. Instead of retreating, Monet picked up his brushes and walked to the Seine. The river moved past him, catching light in ways that shifted every few minutes. Reflections that wouldn't hold still long enough for traditional techniques. The soft bristles of his brush touched canvas again. Not in his cramped studio this time, but outdoors, chasing something the Academy had never taught him to see. Light itself as it moved across water, through leaves, over the surfaces of an awakening world. In the distance, church bells drifted across the water, that deep bronze sound that seems to hang in the air longer than it should. Perhaps Monet heard them too, marking time while he painted time itself, capturing moments that were already disappearing. What he couldn't know then was that those rejections were leading somewhere, that his stubborn attention to fleeting light would help birth something the world had never seen before. But that story, well, that unfolds slowly, like the way morning light creeps across still water. Let me show you how it happened. The Paris of 1863 wasn't the Paris we might picture today. No Eiffel Tower yet piercing the sky, no grand boulevards carved through ancient neighborhoods. Haussmann's renovations were still tearing through the medieval heart of the city, creating wounds of dust and rubble where narrow streets once wandered like forgotten thoughts. The air carried different scents then. Sharp linseed oil and turpentine from countless cramped studios. Wood smoke from chimneys that heated rooms where artists shivered through winter nights, choosing paint over coal. And everywhere, the acrid smell of change itself. Mortar dust and ambition mixing in the narrow passages where young painters carried their canvases like flags of rebellion. I've stood in rooms like the ones Monet rented in those early years. Small spaces where the floorboards creaked under the weight of an easel, where northern light filtered through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months. The kind of places where you learn to make do, where every franc spent on ultramarine blue meant another day of bread and coffee for dinner. The Salon system ruled everything then. Picture a pyramid made of marble and tradition with the École des Beaux-Arts at its peak. Every spring, thousands of paintings would arrive at the Palais de l'Industrie, submitted by artists who had spent months, sometimes years, preparing their entries. The selection jury, men in dark coats with particular ideas about what constituted proper art, would walk through endless galleries, accepting perhaps one painting in 4. Those rejected works, they carried them out by the cartload. I know that feeling, watching something you've poured yourself into being dismissed by voices that never asked what you were trying to say. But here's what strikes me about that system. It wasn't just about keeping standards, it was about keeping control, about ensuring that art continued to tell the same stories in the same ways. The accepted paintings told stories of gods and heroes, of historical moments frozen in perfect moral clarity. They were smooth as porcelain, every brushstroke invisible, every shadow precisely calculated. Beautiful, certainly, masterful in their way, but they spoke to the light of the studio, not the light of the world. Meanwhile, Something else was stirring in those cramped rooms and makeshift studios scattered across Montmartre and the Latin Quarter. Artists who had grown tired of painting other people's dreams, who wanted to step outside to catch the morning light as it moved across a woman's face, or the way fog lifted from the Seine at dawn. Monet's hands knew the feel of rough canvas beneath his fingertips, the smooth wooden palette worn by use until it felt like an extension of his thumb. He was learning something that couldn't be taught in any academy: how to see not just objects, but the light that revealed them. How to notice that the same haystack looked entirely different at 6 in the morning than it did at noon. This wasn't rebellion for its own sake. I think sometimes we imagine these young artists as deliberately provocative, setting out to shock the establishment. But what I see in Monet's early work is something more patient, more observant. He was simply painting what he saw, the way he saw it. The café conversations of those years. If we could listen in on the evening gatherings at the Café Gerbois, we'd hear something remarkable. Not manifestos or grand theories, but working painters talking shop. How to capture the reflection of clouds in moving water. Whether you could suggest the weight of snow with pure white, or if you needed the faintest touch of blue. Émile Zola was there sometimes, taking notes for novels he hadn't written yet. Edouard Manet, already notorious for paintings that refused to explain themselves. And Monet, listening more than talking, storing up ideas like a farmer storing grain against winter. The city itself was changing around them. Those medieval neighborhoods that Haussmann was demolishing, they held a different kind of light. Narrow streets where shadows pooled and shifted throughout the day, where laundry hung between buildings like prayer flags marking the passage of ordinary time. The new Paris would be grander, more rational. But something would be lost in all that geometric precision. I think about the Seine in those years, before the embankments were fully built, when the river still claimed its own space in wet seasons. Monet would walk those muddy banks with his easel, setting up wherever the light caught his attention. The gentle rush of water against stone, the way morning mist rose from the surface like visible silence. He was developing what we might call a different relationship with time, not the frozen moment of academic painting, but time as it actually moves, gradually with infinite subtle variations. A poplar tree doesn't just stand there being a tree, it breathes with the wind, catches light differently as clouds pass overhead, exists in conversation with the changing day. This required a different kind of patience than the Salon painters knew. Not the patience to render every detail with microscopic precision, but the patience to wait, to watch, to let the moment reveal itself, to paint quickly when the light was right, even if that meant leaving things unfinished by academic standards. The rejection letters came regularly in those years, polite, formulaic responses that never explained exactly what was wrong, only that the work didn't meet current standards. I've been there, in different circumstances. That moment when you realize the gatekeepers aren't interested in what you're offering, no matter how sincerely you offer it. But here's something I've learned about rejection. Sometimes it's not a judgment on your work. Sometimes it's evidence that you're moving towards something that doesn't have a name yet. Something that requires new words, new ways of seeing. The sound of wooden sabots on cobblestone streets, market vendors setting up before dawn, the distant hoot of foghorns from Le Havre Harbour, carrying across the water to the cliffs where Monet painted. These were the rhythms that shaped his days. Not the measured chimes of academic schedules, but the irregular, organic timing of light and weather and human need. In those small studios, with their creaking floorboards and insufficient heat, something was taking shape that would eventually change how we see the world. Not through grand gestures or dramatic statements, but through the accumulated weight of attention, of showing up day after day to paint what was actually there, instead of what was supposed to be there. The earthy sweetness of hay drying in Norman fields, the damp green scent of morning dew on water lilies, the acrid smell of wood smoke from village chimneys mixing with crisp winter air. These weren't just backgrounds for proper subjects. They were the subjects. They were enough. Monet was learning to trust his own eyes, even when everyone else was telling him they saw incorrectly. That's not an easy thing to do. It requires a particular kind of stubbornness, a willingness to keep working, even when you can't quite articulate what you're working toward. Perhaps that's why the rejections didn't break him. He was too busy discovering something to worry over much about defending it. But discovery, I've learned, doesn't pay for paint. And by 1866, Monet was running out of both money and canvas. The letters from this period tell a story that anyone who's ever tried to build something knows by heart. There's that particular weight in your stomach when you open the mailbox and find another rejection, another door closed. Monet's correspondence with his friend Frédéric Bazille reads like a catalogue of small disasters: rent overdue, creditors knocking, canvases seized by landlords who couldn't see the revolutionary brushstrokes, only unpaid bills. In one letter from July 1866, Monet writes from Ville d'Avray, "I have indeed been worried. A number of my canvases have been seized, along with my clothes. I was put out of the inn, naked as a worm." Naked as a worm. There's something almost biblical in that phrase, something that strips away all pretense. Here was a man who would one day be celebrated in museums around the world, reduced to begging friends for the price of a meal. But here's what strikes me about those letters. Even in his desperation, even when asking Bazille for yet another loan, Monet keeps describing what he's seeing. The way morning light catches the leaves, how shadow falls across water. The man is nearly homeless, and he's still paying attention to the world as if it might disappear if he looks away. I know that feeling. Not the poverty, perhaps, but that sense that what you're building matters more than your comfort, more than safety, more than the approval of people who should know better. It's a dangerous feeling. It can destroy you if you're wrong. But if you're right. The summer of 1866 found Monet in Chailly-en-Bière, near the forest of Fontainebleau, working on what he hoped would be his breakthrough piece. A massive canvas, over 8 feet tall, depicting fashionable Parisians having a picnic in dappled forest light. He called it Luncheon on the Grass, and he intended it as his answer to both Edouard Manet's scandalous painting of the same name and the classical traditions that had rejected his smaller works. Picture him there in the forest, wrestling with this enormous canvas, trying to capture not just the scene, but the feeling of being in that light, surrounded by the green cathedral of oak and beech. The technical challenges alone would have defeated most painters. How do you show fabric that's simultaneously in shadow and catching reflected light from nearby leaves? How do you paint conversation, laughter, the way people's faces change when they're relaxed and unguarded? He worked with models when he could afford them, alone when he couldn't. Camille Dancieux, who would later become his first wife, posed for several of the female figures. Local accounts describe seeing this young man, paint-stained and intense, hauling his massive canvas through the forest paths, chasing the light as it shifted through the day. But size, as any of us who've tried to scale too quickly knows, brings its own problems. The painting was too large for his studio, too expensive to transport, too ambitious for his current resources. By autumn, with creditors closing in and winter approaching, Monet had to abandon the work unfinished. He would later cut it into pieces, saving what fragments he could. There's a particular ache in that image. This young artist, scissors in hand, cutting apart months of work because he can't afford to store it whole. But even in that destruction, there was something of his emerging philosophy. If he couldn't preserve the entire vision, he would save the moments that worked. The light-filled fragments were more valuable than the compromised whole. Winter came early that year, and with it the kind of cold that seems to seep through every crack in a poorly heated room. Monet found himself back in Paris, sharing a studio with Basile, dependent on his friend's generosity and family money. For someone who had spent months working alone in natural light, the return to cramped quarters and artificial illumination must have felt like imprisonment. Yet the letters from this period reveal something unexpected. Instead of despair, there's a growing clarity about what he wanted to achieve. Being forced away from the forest made him appreciate what he'd learned there. The way light moved, how color changed with the time of day, the difference between what his eyes saw and what his training told him he should paint. "I want to paint the air," he wrote to Basile. "Not objects in air, but the air itself, the medium through which everything else becomes visible." It was an impossible goal, which perhaps made it the only goal worth pursuing. Spring brought another chance. The Salon of 1866 accepted one of his works, a portrait of Camille in a green dress. The acceptance felt like vindication until he saw the painting hanging in the vast exhibition hall, surrounded by hundreds of other works, fighting for attention in the cacophony of frames and subjects. Success, he realized, could be as disorienting as failure. The portrait was accomplished, even beautiful, but it was also safe. Traditional enough to pass the jury's scrutiny, conventional enough to avoid scandal. Standing before it in the Salon, Monet felt the peculiar emptiness that comes from getting what you thought you wanted and discovering it's not what you needed. What he needed was outside, away from the politics of exhibition walls and the judgment of committees who evaluated art like accountants reviewing ledgers. That summer, he returned to the Norman coast, to the cliffs and beaches of his childhood, carrying with him everything he'd learned about light and loss. Sainte-Adresse in 1867 was a seaside resort for the wealthy, but early morning and evening belonged to the workers. Fishermen mending nets, children collecting shells, couples walking the water's edge as the sun set over Le Havre's harbor. Monet painted it all, but he painted it differently now. Where once he might have focused on the figures, now he paid equal attention to the space between them. The way light bounced off wet sand, how the color of shadow changed as the sun moved across the sky. He was learning to see the way light unified everything it touched, making connections that traditional composition had tried to impose through artificial means. Garden at Sainte-Adresse emerged from this period, a painting that shows his aunt and father on a terrace overlooking the sea. On the surface, it's a conventional family scene. But look closer, and you see what Monet was discovering. The flowers in the foreground are painted with the same attention as the sailing ships on the horizon. The flags snapping in the breeze have the same visual weight as the seated figures. Everything exists in the same envelope of light, the same moment of time. It's a democratic way of seeing, no hierarchy of importance imposed by tradition or theory, just the honest observation of how light reveals and connects the world. But democracy, as anyone who's tried to introduce new ways of working knows, can be threatening to established order. The months that followed tested that conviction. Camille was pregnant, and Monet found himself facing the oldest dilemma in the world: how to support a family doing work that the world didn't yet understand or value. His father, who had grudgingly supported his artistic studies, cut off financial help when Monet refused to abandon Camille. The respectable path would have been to marry a woman of his own social class, take over the family business, paint as a hobby on weekends. Instead, Monet chose the uncertainty. In August 1867, their son Jean was born in a charity hospital while Monet was in Paris, trying to sell paintings to dealers who didn't understand what they were seeing. The letters from this period are nearly unbearable to read. A young father desperate to provide, watching his work dismissed by people who saw only technique where he was offering vision. But poverty has a way of clarifying what matters. Stripped of everything but the essentials, canvas, paint, light, and the desperate need to capture what he saw, Monet's work became more focused, more urgent. The paintings from late 1867 and 1868 show an artist who had learned to work fast, to trust his first impressions, to capture the fleeting moment before it disappeared forever. The Magpie, painted in the winter of 1868 to 69, might be the most radical snow scene ever created. A simple subject, a single black bird perched on a wooden gate, surrounded by snow-covered fields. But Monet painted that snow not as white, but as blue, violet, gold, every color reflected from the winter sky above. The Salon jury rejected it immediately. Too unconventional, they said. Snow is white, not rainbow-colored. But Monet had learned to see what was actually there rather than what tradition insisted should be there. He was painting truth instead of convention, and truth, I've learned, is often the hardest thing for institutions to accept. London, during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, offered a different kind of education. Fleeing the chaos in France with Camille and baby Jean, Monet found himself in a city where fog transformed light into something almost tangible. The Thames disappeared and reappeared through veils of mist. Buildings became suggestions. Light became architecture. He painted the Thames obsessively that winter, learning how atmosphere could be more solid than stone, more permanent than any monument. These weren't tourist views of London. They were studies in how weather thinks, how light breathes, how the visible world dissolves and reforms moment by moment. The dealer Paul Durand-Ruel discovered Monet's work in London, beginning a relationship that would eventually provide the financial stability the artist needed. But even with a supporter, even with small sales beginning to trickle in, the fundamental challenge remained: how to continue developing a vision that most people couldn't yet see. Returning to France in late 1871, Monet settled in Argenteuil, a village on the Seine northwest of Paris. It was close enough to the capital for occasional trips, but far enough away to work without distraction. The house came with a garden, and for the first time since his childhood, Monet had space to plant flowers, to watch light change across his own landscape. Argenteuil in the 1870s was changing. The railway had connected it to Paris, bringing weekend visitors and new money. Old gardens gave way to boat clubs. Ancient buildings shared space with modern villas. It was the perfect laboratory for an artist interested in how light and time transformed everything they touched. Monet painted the railway bridge at Argenteuil repeatedly, fascinated by how this symbol of modernity looked different in morning mist than in afternoon sun. Steam locomotives crossing ancient rivers, sailboats sharing the water with coal barges, the past and future existing in the same light, the same moment, equally beautiful if you knew how to see them. But perhaps the most important development at Argenteuil was the boat. Monet had a studio built on an old rowing boat, allowing him to paint from the water itself. Imagine the sensation, the gentle rock of current beneath your feet, the way perspective shifts as you drift, the absolute immersion in light reflected from both sky and river. From that floating studio came some of his most innovative work, paintings where the distinction between water and sky nearly disappeared, where reflection became as solid as reality, where the act of painting and the subject of painting merged into a single exploration of how light makes the world visible. His neighbors in Argenteuil thought he was eccentric at best, possibly mad. Here was a grown man floating around the river, painting the same subjects over and over again at different times of day, in different weather, different seasons. What they couldn't see was that he wasn't painting the same subjects. He was painting time itself, change itself, the way light revealed the world as a constant becoming rather than a fixed being. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived not as a single moment, but as a gradual recognition. Other artists began to understand what Monet was discovering. Renoir, Pissarro, Sisley, each bringing their own vision to the shared exploration of light and time. They started painting together, comparing notes, supporting each other through the continued rejections from official exhibitions. In 1873, they decided to stop waiting for institutional approval. If the Salon wouldn't accept their work, they would create their own exhibition. It was a radical decision, one that would change the art world forever. But at the time, it felt less like revolution than simple necessity. The practical challenges were enormous. How to find a space, how to organize the hanging of paintings, how to attract visitors when you're competing with the official Salon, how to convince the press to take seriously an exhibition organized by artists the establishment had rejected. But Monet had learned something valuable during those years of poverty and rejection. He had learned to trust his own eyes, his own judgment, his own sense of what mattered. The world might not be ready for what he was discovering, but the discovery itself was too important to abandon for the sake of acceptance. Standing in his garden at Argenteuil in the spring of 1874, preparing for the exhibition that would eventually make him famous, Monet could hardly have imagined the revolution he was about to unleash. He was simply an artist who had learned to see light clearly, to paint what was actually there rather than what tradition insisted should be there. But sometimes that's how revolutions begin. Not with grand proclamations or manifestos, but with someone looking carefully at the world and having the courage to report what they see, even when everyone else insists they're seeing it wrong. The morning light filtering through his studio windows that spring carried in it all the rejections, all the poverty, all the doubt of the previous decade. But it also carried something else. The possibility that patience and persistence and absolute attention to what matters might eventually change how the world sees itself. And perhaps that's all any of us can do. Pay attention to what we see, trust our own eyes, keep working even when the world tells us we're working toward nothing. The light itself, Monet had learned, would take care of the rest. The turning point came gradually, the way most real changes do. Not in a moment of blinding revelation, but through weeks of standing in the same spot along the Seine, watching the same poplar trees, the same stretch of water, the same cathedral spire in the distance. What changed wasn't what Monet was looking at. It was how he was seeing it. I know that feeling, when you've been working on something so long that your eyes begin to adjust, like walking from bright sunlight into a dim room. At first you see nothing clearly. Then slowly, gradually, shapes emerge that were always there. For Monet, standing with his easel in the morning mist, those shapes were made of light itself. It was sometime in the winter of 1868, near Étretat, when he began to understand that the light falling across his canvas wasn't just illuminating his subject. It was his subject. The haystack wasn't the painting. The way morning light caught the haystack was the painting. The cathedral wasn't the point. The way afternoon shadows carved its facade into something entirely new, that was the point. We might imagine him there in the cold, his breath visible in small puffs, his fingers stiff around the brush. The established painters were warm in their studios, working from sketches, creating pictures that would please the Salon judges. And here was Monet, outside again, chasing something he couldn't yet name, something that seemed to disappear the moment he tried to capture it. The scratch of charcoal on rough paper had given way to quick, deliberate brushstrokes. No more careful modeling of forms, no more gradual building up of shadows and highlights the way his teachers had shown him. Instead, pure color laid down in broken touches, the way light actually behaves when you really watch it. Light doesn't blend smoothly from one tone to another. It flickers, it shifts, it breaks apart and comes back together. His wife Camille understood, I think, before anyone else did. She would bring him coffee in a chipped ceramic cup, the steam rising between them in the morning air, and she wouldn't ask when he'd be finished. She had learned that he wasn't painting objects anymore. He was painting time itself. And time doesn't hold still for anyone. The breakthrough came in dozens of small realizations. That shadows aren't grey or brown, but purple, blue, green, the complementary colours of whatever light is casting them. That water doesn't have a colour of its own, but becomes a moving mirror for everything around it, broken into 1,000 dancing pieces by the slightest breeze. That the same haystack at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening might as well be two completely different subjects. This was dangerous knowledge. It meant that everything the art establishment had taught about permanence, about the eternal qualities that made a painting valuable, all of it was beside the point. Monet was discovering that the most important things couldn't be held onto. They could only be witnessed. I've been there, in my own way. Standing at the edge of what you think you know, realizing that the thing you've been trying so hard to achieve might be the very thing that's keeping you from seeing clearly. It's uncomfortable, that moment when your old methods stop working and you haven't quite figured out what comes next. For Monet, it meant painting the same subject over and over, watching how light moved across it hour by hour. His neighbours in Argenteuil thought he'd lost his mind, setting up his easel in the same spot day after day, painting haystacks as if he'd never seen one before. But that was exactly it. He was teaching himself to see each haystack as if for the first time. The gentle rush of the Seine against its banks became a kind of metronome for this new way of working. Not the careful, deliberate pace of academic painting, but something more urgent. Light doesn't wait. The shadow that falls across a rooftop at 3 in the afternoon is gone by 4. The way fog lifts from a river at dawn. You have perhaps 20 minutes to catch it before it becomes something else entirely. His brushstrokes grew quicker, more confident. Where other painters blended their colours on the palette, Monet began placing pure colours side by side on the canvas, letting the viewer's eye do the mixing. It was a kind of trust. Trusting that if you painted what you actually saw, rather than what you thought you should see, something true would emerge. The Salon judges didn't understand. How could they? They were looking for the timeless, the classical, the carefully finished. Monet was offering them fragments of time itself, moments that would never come again, painted with a directness that felt almost urgent. His submissions were rejected again and again, but something had shifted in how he received those rejections. Perhaps this is what courage looks like, not the absence of doubt, but the willingness to keep working despite it. Monet had found something worth the rejection, worth the poverty, worth the long hours standing in fields while more sensible people stayed indoors. He had found a way of seeing that no one had taught him, that no academy could approve or disapprove, because it belonged entirely to him. The soft, insistent hum of summer insects accompanied his solitary painting sessions. Bees in the clover fields, crickets at dusk, they seemed to understand something about patience that the art world had forgotten. You don't paint a bee. You paint the light that makes its wings visible, the shadow it casts, the way it moves through space and time. Camille would sometimes sit nearby, not posing exactly, but present. The dappled sunlight through leaves would catch her dress, her hat, her hands folded in her lap, and Monet would realize he wasn't painting a portrait. He was painting a moment, the particular quality of light on a Tuesday afternoon in June, the way the world looked from exactly where he stood, at exactly that time. Tomorrow, it would all be different. This was the understanding that would eventually revolutionize everything. Not just painting, but how people thought about seeing itself. That what we call reality isn't a fixed thing, but a constant flow of changing impressions. That perhaps the most honest thing an artist could do was admit that all we ever really have are impressions. Fleeting, subjective, unrepeatable. But in 1868, standing beside the Seine with paint drying on his hands, Monet didn't know he was starting a revolution. He only knew that when he painted this way, quickly, directly, trusting his eye over his training, something came alive on the canvas that had never been there before. Something that felt like seeing itself. The low murmur of conversation from nearby cafes would drift across the water in the evening. Artists and writers debating technique, arguing about the future of art, making grand pronouncements about what painting should become. And here was Monet, working largely alone, discovering that the future of art might have less to do with grand theories and more to do with the simple act of paying attention. I think about this sometimes, when I'm lying awake turning over some problem that seems impossible to solve. How the answer might not be in thinking harder or trying different strategies, but in learning to see what's actually there rather than what I expect to be there. Monet's great insight wasn't about painting, it was about attention itself. The earthy, sweet smell of fresh hay drying in vast Norman fields would have filled the air during harvest time. This scent, this light, this particular moment when summer was turning toward autumn, these weren't just the circumstances in which he painted, they were what he was learning to paint. The circumstances themselves. Other painters painted nouns, woman, haystack, cathedral, water lily. Monet was learning to paint verbs, shimmering, reflecting, changing, becoming. It was a fundamentally different way of approaching the world, and it would take years before anyone understood what he was doing. But understanding, he was discovering, might not be the point. The point might be the willingness to keep looking when everyone else has moved on, to keep painting when the light is changing too fast to capture, to keep working at the edge of your ability when you're not even sure what you're trying to achieve. The rustle and whisper of poplar leaves in a light breeze became the soundtrack to this new understanding. Not dramatic music, not the grand themes that accompanied historical paintings, but the quiet, constant sound of the world simply being itself. This was what Monet was learning to paint, the world being itself, moment by moment, without explanation or apology. Perhaps this is what all real work comes down to in the end. Not the approval of judges or the validation of institutions, but the willingness to pay attention so carefully that you begin to see things that were always there but somehow invisible. To trust that if you can learn to see clearly enough, what you discover will be worth sharing. Standing there in the changing light, watching the Seine flow past, carrying leaves and reflections and the endless variations of sky, Monet was making a choice that would define not just his own work, but the direction of painting itself. He was choosing to paint time rather than things, to paint seeing rather than what is seen. And in that choice, in that quiet moment of understanding beside the water, the old world of art was ending and something entirely new was beginning to emerge. The understanding was quiet when it came. Not the dramatic revelation we sometimes imagine in stories, but the kind of slow recognition that arrives like dawn, gradual, inevitable, changing everything without fanfare. Monet had found his true subject, but now came the harder question: what to do with it? I know that feeling of standing at the edge of something new, when the old certainties have fallen away, but the path forward isn't yet clear. That's where Monet found himself in those months that followed. He had discovered he was painting light itself, painting time as it moved across surfaces and through air. But the art world around him remained unchanged, still demanding the careful finish, the noble subjects, the unchanging forms that had defined painting for centuries. The years that followed were perhaps the most challenging of his life. Not because he doubted his vision, that clarity beside the Seine had settled something deep within him, but because living with that vision day after day, while the world rejected it, required a different kind of courage, than the bold stroke of discovery. It required the quiet endurance of the long middle when the revelation has come, but the recognition has not. His paintings grew bolder, more radical. Where once he had pushed against the boundaries of acceptable technique, now he seemed to abandon them entirely. The Seine series that emerged from this period shows water not as a mirror reflecting static objects, but as a living thing, breathing with light. Each canvas captured a moment so specific, so fleeting, that viewing them was like watching time itself flow past. The rejection became more complete. The Salon, which had occasionally accepted his earlier work, now turned him away with increasing regularity. Critics who had once praised his promise now spoke of wasted talent, of a promising young painter who had lost his way, chasing effects that belonged more to photography than to serious art. But something remarkable was happening in the smaller circles, in the conversations that took place in modest studios and quiet cafes. Other painters began to notice what Monet was doing. Not many, but enough. Renoir working his own path through color and light. Pissarro with his patient eye for the rhythms of rural life. Sisley, who understood something about the way afternoon sun could transform an ordinary street into something luminous. They began to find each other. These painters, who were all, in their own ways, chasing something the official art world couldn't yet name. It wasn't organized at first, just conversations, shared struggles, the recognition that passes between people who are working towards something similar, even when they can't quite articulate what it is. I've been there, in those moments when you realize you're not alone in seeing something differently. It doesn't make the path easier, but it makes it possible. Knowing that someone else sees what you see, values what you value, even when the larger world remains indifferent or hostile. The financial pressure remained constant. Camille, his model and soon-to-be wife, understood the choice he was making, but couldn't shield him from its consequences. There were months when they couldn't afford canvas, when he painted on whatever surfaces he could find. Times when the bailiffs came, when they had to move again, carrying their few possessions and his growing collection of unsold paintings. Yet the work continued. Perhaps it had to. When you've seen something clearly, really clearly, it becomes almost impossible to unsee it. Monet had seen that light was everything, that the cathedral and the haystack and the water lily were just excuses, just stages for light to perform its endless transformations. And once seen, that understanding demanded expression, regardless of reception or reward. The paintings from this period reveal an artist working with increasing freedom and decreasing concern for conventional success. His brushstrokes became more visible, more confident. Color began to carry meanings beyond representation, blues that spoke of coolness and distance. Oranges that hummed with warmth and proximity, violets that suggested the liminal moments of dawn and dusk. He painted the same subjects repeatedly, which struck critics as either lazy or obsessive. They couldn't understand that he wasn't painting the same thing twice, that the haystack at 8 in the morning was fundamentally different from the haystack at 4 in the afternoon. Not because the haystack had changed, but because the light had transformed it into something entirely new. Each painting was a portrait of a moment that would never come again. The small group of like-minded painters began meeting more regularly. They shared not just aesthetic ideas, but practical concerns: how to exhibit work that no official venue would accept, how to find buyers who might understand what they were attempting. They talked about organizing their own exhibitions, showing their work on their own terms rather than waiting for permission from institutions that seemed incapable of recognizing what they were doing. Monet's role in these conversations was often that of the quiet experimenter. While others debated theory, he talked about technique, about painting wet into wet to capture the exact quality of morning mist, about working faster than traditional methods allowed. about the particular blues that appeared in shadows on snow. His contributions were practical, specific, grounded in the daily work of trying to translate what he saw onto canvas. But beneath the technical discussions lay something deeper. They were all, in their different ways, trying to paint modern life as it actually felt, not as academic tradition said it should look. The world was changing rapidly. Industrialization, urbanization, new technologies of transportation and communication were altering the rhythms of daily experience. These painters were finding ways to capture those new rhythms, those new relationships between people and light and time. Monet's domestic life during this period was marked by both struggle and quiet joy. His relationship with Camille deepened beyond the artist-model dynamic into something more companionate and enduring. She appears in many paintings from these years, not posed formally but caught in natural moments, reading by a window, walking in a garden, sitting by the water with their young son Jean. These intimate paintings reveal another aspect of Monet's developing vision. Light, he was discovering, wasn't just an aesthetic phenomenon, but an emotional one. The way afternoon sun fell across Camille's face as she sewed could convey tenderness more directly than any symbolic gesture. The dappled light filtering through leaves to illuminate Jean at play spoke of innocence and protection and the passage of time in ways that traditional portraiture, with its emphasis on permanent character, simply couldn't match. The financial pressures sometimes forced difficult choices. There were paintings he sold too early, before they were truly finished, because the money was needed immediately. Others he kept working on long past the point where they might have found buyers, driven by his growing understanding that each painting was an experiment in capturing something that had never been captured before. His letters from this period reveal someone who was becoming increasingly clear about his artistic direction, even as external circumstances remained uncertain. He wrote to friends about specific effects he was trying to achieve, about the challenge of painting water in different seasons, about his growing conviction that the traditional hierarchy of subjects, history painting at the top, landscape near the bottom, was not only wrong but actively harmful to the development of art. The art world, meanwhile, continued largely oblivious to what was developing in these modest studios and rented rooms. The Salon continued to reward paintings that demonstrated technical skill in service of elevated subjects. Critics continued to praise works that seemed to them serious, permanent, untouched by the ephemeral concerns of daily life. But change was coming, slowly and from unexpected directions. Collectors who were less bound by academic taste began to notice these experiments in light and time. Writers like Émile Zola, who understood that literature too needed to find new ways of representing modern experience, began to see connections between what these painters were attempting and what he was trying to achieve in prose. The group that had formed around shared concerns began to solidify into something that approached a movement. Though they still lacked a name for what they were doing, they talked increasingly seriously about organizing an independent exhibition, a showing that would present their work on its own terms rather than in competition with academic painting. Monet's work during this period shows an artist who had found his direction and was pursuing it with increasing confidence, even as external recognition remained elusive. The paintings breathe with a freedom that comes from working toward your own vision rather than someone else's expectations. They capture not just the appearance of things, but the feeling of being alive in particular moments, in specific qualities of light and air. Perhaps that's what sustained him through these years of rejection and struggle. The knowledge that he was painting something true, something that hadn't been painted before. Each successful canvas was evidence that his understanding was correct, that light really was everything, that the fleeting moment could contain as much meaning as the eternal pose. The transformation was almost complete now. The artist who had begun by seeking approval from official institutions was becoming someone entirely different, someone who trusted his own vision more than external validation, who understood that the most important conversations happen not in exhibition halls, but in the daily work of looking closely, painting honestly, and sharing what you see with others who are brave enough to see it too. The stage was set for something unprecedented. These artists, who had found each other through rejection and shared experiment, were about to step into public view, to present their vision of light and time and modern life to a world that wasn't ready for it. But readiness, they were learning, wasn't required. Sometimes you simply had to show what you had seen, and trust that somewhere in the vast world there would be others ready to see it too. And so, in April of 1874, they opened their doors. Not to the grand halls of the Salon with its velvet ropes and gilded frames, but to the abandoned studios of photographer Nadar on the Boulevard des Capucines. 30 artists hung their work on plain walls, asking the public to see what they had spent years learning to show. The light streaming through those windows that first morning, I imagine it fell on canvases that shimmered with a different kind of truth than Paris had seen before. They called themselves the Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors, Printmakers, and so forth. Such a modest name for such a revolution. But perhaps that's how the most profound changes arrive, quietly, without fanfare, carried by people who have simply learned to see differently and trust what their eyes tell them, even when the world insists they're wrong. The critics came as critics do. Most were bewildered, some were cruel. They looked at Monet's painting, Impression Sunrise, that loose, shimmering vision of Le Havre harbour emerging from morning mist. And one critic, Louis Leroy, used the word Impressionism as mockery. How could these rough brushstrokes, this suggestion rather than definition, this capturing of a moment rather than the eternal, be considered art? But mockery sometimes gives a name to what was always meant to be. The artists embraced the word. They were impressionists, painters of light and time and the fleeting beauty of moments that would never come again. What had been intended as dismissal became a banner, a way of saying, yes, this is what we do, this is what we see, this is what matters to us. The public reception was mixed, sometimes harsh. People stood before Monet's canvases looking for the precise detail they expected, the careful finish that proved an artist's skill. Instead, they found something that seemed unfinished, uncertain, alive with possibility. Some walked away confused or angry, but others stood longer, letting their eyes adjust, beginning to see what Monet had discovered in all those years of patient looking. They saw light itself made visible. They saw the way morning mist could transform a familiar harbour into something mysterious and new. They saw that a haystack wasn't just a haystack, but a surface on which the entire sky could write its changing moods. They saw that a cathedral wasn't only stone and history, but a living thing that breathed differently in each hour's light. Success, when it came, arrived the way dawn arrives, gradually, then suddenly unmistakable. Not all at once, not with fanfare, but through the slow accumulation of understanding. One viewer at a time, one painting at a time, one moment of recognition that perhaps this loose, vibrant way of seeing came closer to truth than all the polished precision that had come before. I think about Monet in those early exhibition years, watching people discover his work. The uncertainty must have been enormous. After so many years of rejection, so many nights wondering if he was chasing something real or simply deluding himself, here was the test. Not the approval of the Salon, but something more precious. The moment when another person looked at his canvas and suddenly understood what he had been trying to show them. The financial struggles didn't end immediately. Recognition comes in waves, and the tide of public taste moves slowly. But something fundamental had shifted. Monet was no longer painting alone, no longer the solitary figure standing by the Seine with his easel, wondering if anyone would ever understand what he saw in the play of light on water. He had found his tribe, his fellow travelers, in this new way of seeing. Renoir, with his gift for capturing the warmth of human connection in dappled sunlight. Pissarro, patient and methodical in his devotion to the honest observation of rural life. Sisley, who painted the changing seasons with such quiet precision that you could feel the particular quality of light that belonged to each month of the year. Together, they had created not just individual paintings, but a new language for describing what it felt like to be alive in a world of constant change. By the 1880s, something remarkable was happening. People began to seek out Impressionist paintings, to collect them, to hang them in their homes. The quick, confident brushstrokes that had once seemed careless now appeared bold and modern. The attention to fleeting light effects, once dismissed as superficial, was recognized as a profound meditation on time and impermanence. Monet's series paintings, the haystacks, the poplars, the cathedrals, showed the world something it had never quite noticed before. That everything we see is constantly changing, that there is no single, fixed way anything looks, only an endless succession of appearances as light and atmosphere and time move through our days. Standing before these paintings, viewers began to understand that Monet wasn't painting objects at all, but painting light itself as it touched and transformed everything it fell upon. The breakthrough came not when the world changed its mind about art, but when Monet had learned to trust completely in what only he could see. All those years of rejection hadn't been wrong turns or wasted time. They had been the necessary schooling, the patient development of an eye that could perceive what others missed, a hand that could capture what had never been captured before. In his later years, working in his garden at Giverny, Monet pushed even further into pure light and color. The water lily paintings of his final decades dissolved the boundaries between representation and abstraction, between the thing seen and the sensation of seeing. Standing before those vast canvases, viewers found themselves not looking at a pond, but somehow inside the experience of light dancing on water, of reflections mingling with reality until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I know that feeling of standing before one of those late water lily paintings. The way the painted surface seems to breathe, to shift and change as you watch. The sense that you're not looking at a representation of something, but at light itself, color itself, the very substance of seeing made visible. It's like standing at the edge of a meditation that has lasted decades, a long, patient contemplation of what it means to truly see. The critics who had once mocked those rough brushstrokes, those unfinished surfaces, began to write about the poetry of Impressionism, the way these paintings captured not just the appearance of things, but their essence. What had seemed like carelessness was revealed as extraordinary sensitivity. What had appeared unfinished was recognized as perfectly complete, not concerned with showing everything, but with showing exactly what mattered. Monet lived to see his revolution succeed beyond anything he could have imagined. Museums competed for his paintings. Collectors paid extraordinary sums for work that had once been impossible to sell. Young artists traveled to Giverny to learn from the master who had taught the world a new way of seeing. But perhaps the deepest success wasn't the fame or the money or the recognition. Perhaps it was simply this, that Monet had remained faithful to his vision long enough for the world to catch up to what he had always known. That light was worthy of a lifetime's attention, that fleeting moments deserved to be preserved, that the play of color and atmosphere on a simple subject could reveal truths as profound as any painted allegory or historical scene. Standing in his garden at Giverny in his final years, nearly blind but still painting, Monet had become something like what he had always painted. A figure dissolving into light, a presence more felt than seen, someone who had spent so long looking at the world that he had become part of its constant changing. The young man who had been rejected by the Salon, who had struggled to buy paint and canvas, who had wondered if anyone would ever understand what he was trying to show them, had lived long enough to see his way of seeing become the world's way of seeing. How did one artist's unwavering gaze on fleeting light redefine a movement? Perhaps the answer lies not in any single breakthrough, but in the simple persistence of looking. Day after day, season after season, year after year, paying attention to what others overlooked. Trusting that the play of light on water, the way morning mist transformed a familiar landscape, the 1,000 different ways a haystack could catch and hold the changing light, were worthy of a lifetime's devotion. In those late water lily paintings, you can see the culmination of everything Monet had learned about looking and seeing and showing. The boundaries between subject and painter, between the thing observed and the act of observation, have dissolved completely. There is only light, only color, only the eternal dance of reflection and change that Monet had spent decades learning to capture. The story that began with rejection ends with revolution. But quietly, the way light changes throughout a day, gradually, inevitably, transforming everything without seeming to try. Like light dissolving into dusk, like reflections merging with reality on the surface of a still pond, like the gentle persistence of someone who understood that the most profound changes come not through force or argument, but through the patient demonstration of a new way of seeing. Let this story of unwavering vision, of trust in what only one person could perceive, of faith that somewhere in the vast world there would be others ready to see what you had learned to show them, carry you gently toward rest, toward the kind of peace that comes when we stop struggling against our own vision and learn instead to trust what our deepest looking reveals. The way Monet trusted light, the way light itself trusts the endless turning of the world to bring it new surfaces to illuminate, new moments to transform, new possibilities for beauty that we never imagined we were capable of seeing.